kind of beetles that are most likely to cause direct injury in some sort of fruit or nut crop or even some vegetables would be weevils. They're a family of beetles. The weevils are called sometimes snout beetles because the front end of their head is enormously elongated. And at the very tip of this beak, we'll call it a beak, are their mouth parts, and you can see their antennae are also associated with that long beak. So the chewing mouth parts, they're gonna have regular chewing mouth parts, but they're just right there at the tip, and this allows them to feed into things, so they can move into a bud or into a developing fruit. And the kind of larvae that you'll see, a weevil larva, is a pretty stripped down beetle larva. So on the picture in the upper left, we have a weevil larva. They have a distinct head, and they're going to have chewing mouth parts. The kind of injury these things are going to be doing is chewing, and they've got strong jaws, and it's a pretty well developed head, but no legs anywhere. No legs on the thorax, no legs on no prolegs like a caterpillar would have. So pretty much stripped down. I kind of think they look like a piece of puffed rice with a head on it or something. Now, the next group of insects you're going to be finding in fruit will be fly larvae, like apple maggot and some of the other fruit flies. And a fly larva is even more reduced in terms of what they're going to look like. So the picture in the lower left is a typical fly larva of the type you might find in certain fruits. In this case, the head end is to the right. They do not even have a head capsule. And the kind of way they feed are with mouth hooks that they can evert from that pointed little end. But they're very stripped down and also have no thoracic legs and no prolegs. But the head difference is what you're going to key in on to get this to be a weevil larva. So there's a number of weevils that could be found in gardens. This is a little off topic, because it's a flower pest, but my favorite weevil in my garden is the hollyhock weevil. It's a very tiny weevil, and it's only associated with hollyhock. The females are very different from the males in terms of the length of the beak, and you'll see this with some others too. The beak of the female is always longer than the male. So they can do a couple of kinds of injury. The thing that most people notice in hollyhocks that are growing around here that have got this weevil is the leaves will have holes in them. And this is a kind of injury that we've discussed a little bit with when we talked about flea beetles, a shot hole kind of injury. However, the way they do it is different. So the way these little holes you're seeing in the leaf were produced was not that the adult beetle was feeding on the leaf. That's possible, but almost all of it happened when the beetle was feeding into that leaf when it was a little bud, and they were chewing through it, or when the leaves hadn't fully expanded, and they drilled through several layers, and then they came out and produced these little holes. So much of the holes you see occurred when it was in the bud stage rather than when it was a fully expanded leaf. A little bit different. But then when there are developing seeds available in flowers, you'll see them moving into the flower buds, and the females will chew their way into the buds. In the picture in the upper right, we see a female with her proboscis, her beak, almost buried entirely into the plant. She's chewed way deeply in. The male that is there on the back. Males are often on the back of the female when you see them in the garden. But after that, she will then lay an egg in that hole, and the young will feed on the seeds. So many weevil larvae will see in the seeds, and they'll pupate in the seeds. And for this insect, the way it survives between seasons is in infested seeds of the plant. Just again, a little background, just weevils before we take off. The most important agricultural pest maybe we ever had historically, or the one that has caused the most effects in American history, is an insect that affected the cotton crop in the southern U.S. About 120 or so years ago, called the boll weevil. And again, the same thing. It's a weevil with a long snout. The female will bury deeply or chew deeply into either the developing fruit of the cotton plant or the young fruit and lay her eggs in it, and the young will develop and destroy the fruit that ultimately would turn into a boll of cotton. This had a tremendous effect on the economy of the southern U.S. It was devastating and also caused people to have to grow things differently. And during the time the boll weevil was in its heyday, more insecticides were applied against this insect and more pesticides of any kind than anything. Nothing was even a close second. If you get into the story of the boll weevil, you'll see that it has a good ending. It's much less of a problem now, and it's also been eradicated from much of the area in the eastern U.S. Where it originally occurred through a combined set of practices that was done to suppress it and cause it to retreat back to areas to the south of the to the extreme southern U.S. where it originated from. Anyway, getting back on target, an insect that would affect a food crop that might be important in some areas is pecan weevil, probably the most important single pest if you're growing pecans. As you can see in the picture in the upper left, the female there again is on the bottom, much longer snout than a male. And the damage this will do would be to the nuts that we're trying to harvest. So the female, if she finds a nut of the right kind, right condition, right stage, she will chew into it, and it's quite an effort. I like this series of pictures showing the female setting up and trying to chew a little and getting a little deeper and getting a little deeper, getting a little deeper. And ultimately they go through the shuck, and they also go through the kernel and reach the fruit. And if they just do that and feed a little bit, there will be a little wound. And one thing that if you grow pecans, you might be familiar with is a stick-tight nut, they call it, one that doesn't shell out. And that could be because of a wound, such as a pecan weevil could make, that then causes the kernel to attach to the nut. But that's secondary to what happens if she lays an egg into the chewed area that she produced, and the eggs then hatch, and then the larvae feed on that nut and would destroy it. So these would be a couple of pecan weevil larvae, nearly full grown. They look inside some nuts. The eggs hatch in about a week, and it takes about a month for them to be fully grown, and then they leave. In this case, they'll cut their way through the husk, and they'll drop to the ground. And the picture on the right has a nice picture of a larva still in the shell. But you also see those little holes. Those are exit holes that were made when the larva burrowed its way out and then dropped to the ground. Drops to the ground and then goes into the soil several inches. So these big legless larvae can burrow several inches. They'll tamp out a little chamber, and then they may pupate. And if they pupate, they don't come out the next year. They don't come out until the year after that. Or they may wait. They may not pupate until the next year, and then they wait another year. So they may not come out until the third year. So these insects have a really long life cycle, but most of it occurs in the ground, and they don't come out all the same way. Again, some may stay in the soil for a year, and some may stay in the soil for 2 years. And this may seem a kind of odd kind of behavior, but on nut crops, on fruit crops, sometimes there can be failures of the crop for whatever reason. It could be often freezing around here, but something. And if there was no nuts, then that would be a devastating, that will have devastating effects on something that's totally dependent on there being nuts. So some of them, they wait till the next year and kind of gives them an extra shot. So we'll see that sometimes with other fruit insects, where they'll diapause for quite a long time, just to make sure there's a few around, even if the fruit's gone for a few years due to some sort of catastrophe. Now, we talk quite a bit about uh, pheromone traps for some of the insects that are moths, and they've got wonderful pheromones that the female produces to attract the male. In beetles, you don't. And in beetles, you usually have more of a visual type of trap. And there's a number of traps that have been developed for pecan weevil and some other weevils. A cone trap would just be a cone on the ground with a collecting container in the top, and this would pick up the adults as they emerged out of the soil. And then if you caught a certain number, there's a threshold levels that would say if a certain number had emerged, then you had a problem. Or there might be some other style traps. Another one that's used for many kinds of weevils is just called a pyramid trap, and essentially it's a long, thin pyramid with a little collecting cup. The kind of stimulus that is being keyed in on here is the insect emerges and then flies to a trunk of a tree, and the dark pyramid is essentially simulating the trunk of a tree in this case. So they will go there, they'll climb up, and they'll be caught in the container. Notice the tree on the right was got the white around it, and that's to try to make that tree not be attractive, so that the weevils that emerge right around the vicinity of the trap would go toward the trap rather than the tree. But the best trap, the one you'll see being recommended in Texas, New Mexico, Oklahoma, anyway, areas where this crop is produced, is usually a circle trap, and it's affixed right to the trunk. It's put on the north or west or northwest side of the trunk, which is where most of them will be flying to. And again, they ultimately get caught in this little container at the top, and a certain number of them being caught would indicate a problem or not. Plum curculio is another kind of weevil that is a pest of many fruits throughout eastern North America, and it's out in the spring, late spring, but they're out in the spring. The adults emerge, and then they move to the fruit, and the adult will cut the fruit and lay the egg underneath the little cut it makes in the fruit surface. The cut is very characteristic. This is a great shot from the Gench lab up in Hudson River area with Cornell. The perfect little semicircle that these things make, and then the egg would be inserted underneath that normally. So a little flap of the fruit skin is cut, the egg is inserted underneath that. So here we see an adult on a blueberry, and then the larva goes inside that, and there's the little cut. The egg-laying scar isn't quite as clearly that crescent shape because of the nature of blueberry fruit. And then again, the larvae develop in that, and then that damages whatever fruit has a larva developing in it. An apple, apple's probably the crop that gets most damaged, but curiously, the insect can't develop in apple. It can just damage it in the process of laying eggs. So in the picture in the upper left, you can see apple with lots of little scars. Those were those little crescent-shaped scars. And then as the apple develops, the egg gets crushed, the insect can't survive. But that scarred area is a permanent wound, and then it will show up as the fruit matures in different ways. So in the upper right is a picture where you get these little dimples. And so we talked about these kind of irregular fruit puckerings already, and we're going to come back to it in a little bit, where something damaged the fruit as it was developing. The climbing cutworms chewed a big chunk in the fruit, and then it came out with a little pucker. In this case, they're chewing a little crescent, and it comes out a little pucker. And later, we'll talk about the bugs that do that with their piercing sucking mouth parts. In areas in the south, we've got pepper weevil, and actually this can move up the coast. It is known as far north as the mid-Atlantic states. So the pepper weevil is a small weevil associated with peppers. The larvae develop in the fruit. It also will cause abortion of fruit. So the weevils, there's a fairly good picture in the upper left. The weevils will lay their eggs on the developing flowers or in the young fruit. So they make a little hole. They lay their eggs in the fruit or in the flowers. The affected plant then aborts. So the young fruit will abort. This is shown in this picture on the right that has a life cycle. The fruit will abort, usually drop to the ground. The larvae develop in the dropped fruit on the ground, ultimately completing development and coming out. So most always you would not have a fully developed fruit. The fruit's damaged and dropping. And this brings up one of the ways to control this. If you look at the details in this life cycle of the pepper weevil, the fruit drops, and it's about 2 weeks or so that it's a larva in there. It's another, could be close to another week when it's a pupa. Well, this is a period of time. If you just periodically would collect the dropped fruit at the base of the plant, you would be breaking its life cycle in a fairly easy way. And then there's one weevil that's quite important in vegetable crops that affects the roots. A little off target here perhaps, but the sweet potato weevil is kind of a special case, and it's so damaging to the roots of a vegetable crop, sweet potato in this case. It's a funny looking weevil. Looks quite a bit different than the others. So the adult weevil, there in the upper left, will usually lay its eggs in stems at the base of the plant, and then the larvae will feed in the stems or then tunnel deeper and ultimately get to the tubers. But the eggs are being laid at the soil surface. She's not digging down to lay her eggs. So the larvae often will develop in the stems, and the stems may yellow, and the foliage may yellow, and the stems may wilt if you have a high level. So you might see that symptom. But then some of them will continue to move down the stem and into the sweet potatoes below ground, which of course would be far more damaging. So they are riddling the tuber. They produce a bunch of frass, the excrement, and that further degrades it. And this can occur. Sometimes these can occur in storage, so they can cycle even after harvest in a storage. A pretty difficult insect to control. A number of things will help. Crop rotation can be very important with this insect. Sometimes mulches and ways to prevent the insect from accessing the root area, the cracks around the base of the plant, so they can't lay eggs there. A few biocontrols are out, but it's a pretty tough insect to manage. And then just coming back on what a weevil larva looks like, there is another kind of insect that is a beetle that is not uncommonly found damaging things in the soil, and that would be what we call a white grub. They're in a different family of insects, and we'll revisit white grubs when we talk about turfgrass insects if you take the third course, the landscape plants course. But white grubs can feed on the roots of many plants, including vegetable crops that grow below ground. Potatoes are particularly damaged. White grubs look a little different from a weevil larva. Both are beetles, but the big difference I think you can see is a white grub will have legs on the thorax, quite prominent legs on the thorax, whereas a weevil larva will not. So both have chewing mouth parts, both have a distinct head. Neither of them have prolegs like a caterpillar would, but a white grub has legs on the thorax, and the weevil larva does not. And for those who want turf for this class, that's coming up too, again in the next section, in the landscape section, and a very important turf grass group is a weevil we call billbugs. That's the grass-feeding weevils. Okay, so let's move on to the flies that affect fruit in the next section.